Привет всем, с вами я, Janie, и это How Janie Learned Russian. Well, we made it through our first chapter on nominative case, and now we begin the next two videos, which are going to be our exam. I once had a linguistics professor call our exams celebrations, so I'm going to keep that same terminology, and we're going to celebrate everything we've learned in this chapter. Today, we'll be talking about how to have conversations with your imaginary Russian friends, because that's what you have to do. Again, we have to make our brain think that we need to know Russian. So today I'll be showing you how to create what I call conversation trees, how to branch out in the conversation and keep the conversation going with your imaginary Russian friends. So let's go ahead and get started. You can do all of this just by speaking. You can also do this writing. But again, ultimately, the ultimate demonstration of your knowledge of Russian is speaking, ideally speaking under pressure with a tutor or a language partner or in our group classes, etc. So for those of you who haven't been following the rest of the course, this is an entire course based on my textbook called Russian Cases Made Slightly Less Scary. That's available over on Patreon. The link is in the description. Also, if you're not aware, we actually are doing group classes right now, and you pay a monthly fee, like a monthly membership, and you can attend as many classes as you possibly can. And that's a great opportunity to test your knowledge of the language a little bit under pressure, but not too under pressure, but at least hold yourself accountable for all the things you've been studying all along. And it's really important to have that end of the week accountability. Just like you would if you were trying to build muscle or meet some fitness goals, having to answer to a physical trainer at the end of the week, that's going to help keep you on task. So today what we're doing, this is at the end of our chapter. So for those of you who have a textbook, this starts on page 19. And what we're doing is, so many people get interested in Russian because they're maybe interested in some aspect of Russian or Soviet history, and I have a vivid imagination, and I like to imagine that what would I say to my favorite person from Russian history is Peter the Great. So how would I talk to Peter the Great? What would I say to him? So this is a great way for you to help your brain understand that it is in fact important to learn Russian, because wouldn't it be awesome if I ever met a Russian and this is what I would say to them, and this is how I would keep the conversation going? Because again, you can't make a friend by just walking up to them and saying, hey, ask me a bunch of questions. It doesn't work like that. You have to ask them questions. You have to go back and forth. So today I'm going to show you how to create a conversation tree with our imaginary Russian friends. For those of you who have the textbook, you'll see that I've chosen a few select individuals from Russian and Soviet history, many of whom you may already know. So our интересный кусочек информации дня is who are these people that I feature all throughout the textbook. So the first one is Yuri Gagarin. For those of you who don't know, he was the первый космонавт. He was the first man in space. And this was his famous words, поехали, like, let's go, let's do it. Поехали. So he's one of our first people that we get to have an imaginary conversation with. So our conversation with him, I know there's probably a million questions you'd like to ask him about, were you scared, blah, blah, blah. But we got to limit what we ask to what's been happening in this chapter so far. So, for example, we might say to him, «Привет, Юра, какая работа у тебя есть? У тебя интересная работа?» Right? So how would we ask him about his work? He has pretty interesting, very risky work. So we just asked him, какая работа? What kind of job do you have? Какая работа у тебя есть? And then Yuri Alexeyevich responds by saying, у меня очень интересная, но трудная работа. Трудная работа, да, это точно, трудная работа. And then how would you follow up? How would you branch out based on his answer and keep the conversation going? So you might say something like, вы космонавт, right? So notice we're using our correct pronoun here. We're not saying вас, космонавт. We're not saying ваш. We're saying вы, you, космонавт. He says, да, и пилот. Интересно, пилот. Да, и пилот. Okay, so now what could we say? Based on the knowledge we've learned so far in this chapter, we could ask him, does he like that work? Вам нравится такая работа? And then we got to anticipate how might he possibly answer. So as we create these imaginary dialogues in our head, it makes Russian relevant, right? It makes us be like, oh, what's that word I need? Oh, how do I say that in Russian? So it proves to our brain that we need Russian, okay? So we just asked him, вам нравится такая работа? Right? Remember our chapter on нравится and такой, такая. So we say, вам нравится такая работа? And he says, конечно, но иногда страшно. Да, страшно, значит, страшно. Вот. No, конечно, но иногда страшно, right? And then if you really wanted to challenge yourself, you'd just keep going off of his answers, just keep coming up with more and more branches on this conversation tree. All right, let's take it in another direction. We ask him, so we know he's a cosmonaut and a pilot. Let's ask him, are you a dad? Do you have kids? Right? So let's go back to that chapter on having and we say, у вас есть дети? Да? У вас есть дети? And then we say, вы папа? Are you a dad? And then he says, да, у нас двое детей. У нас двое детей. А у вас? Oh, look, now he's talking to you, and then you could answer for yourself. So again, this is all really fun because it helps you anticipate the words and questions you would need to keep a conversation alive. Keep it going with a Russian, because inevitably you will overhear somebody somewhere speaking Russian, and you're going to want to go up to them and ask them, oh, how long have you lived here? Hey, nice to meet you. I'm studying Russian, right? And you're going to want to be able to have a conversation that's not just about you because that's impolite. Okay, so let's go to our next person from our imaginary Russian friends. Many of you will know him, Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky, right? So he's the famous author of Щелкунчик, which is very popular at Christmas time. And you'll actually, if you don't know much about his personal life, you might learn some interesting things about him just based on what I have in the textbook, because I did try and base it on facts. So imagine that we know Tchaikovsky, ему нравится музыка, да? Точно. So, but now we want to ask him, like, what kind of music does he like? Do you remember how to ask that? What was that word for what kind? It's kind of an all-purpose word. So you would say, какая музыка вам нравится? Какая музыка вам нравится? And then he answers, answers, мне нравится русская народная музыка и моя музыка, конечно. Да? Русская народная музыка is like folk music, and that's incorporated into a lot of Tchaikovsky's music. То есть мне нравится русская народная музыка и моя музыка, конечно. Вот. Okay, let's think of some branches we could shoot off to keep this conversation. Imagine you really didn't know much about Tchaikovsky and you needed to be like, oh, sorry, Pyotr Ilyich, which music is yours? So how would you do that? Which music is yours? Какая музыка ваша? Какая музыка ваша? And then he would tell you, Щелкунчик, увертюра, 1812 года, which is the 1812 overture, и многие другие, да? And then imagine you're keeping that conversation going and you want to say, oh, I don't like ballet. And you say, well, мне не нравится балет. Это очень скучно. Yeah? And then he'll get offended, and then maybe you guys get into a fight of some sort, that вы не культурный человек, как вам не стыдно, надо ходить на балет, надо ходить на оперу. And then you say, нет, я люблю рок, мне нравится рок-музыка. And then Tchaikovsky gets offended, and anyway, all right, okay. So just again, it's your imaginary friend, so you and Tchaikovsky can talk about whatever you want in your head. Another direction we could take our conversation tree is we ask him further, like, oh, what other musicians do you like? Какие музыканты вам нравятся? Какие музыканты вам нравятся? So sure enough, he would have been influenced by some of the musicians of the 18th century. So he says, мне нравится Beethoven и Mozart. and then you're kind of confused about the time on that, were they alive at the same time? How would you ask him, are those your friends? Are those your friends? So friends was an irregular plural, and we want the word your. Они ваши друзья? Они ваши друзья? And then Pyotr Ilyich says, да нет, of course not. Какой вы дурак. What an idiot you are. Они давно умерли. They died a long time ago. Да нет. Again, Tchaikovsky can be super mean to you in your head because this is all just imaginary. So it's just fun to make up these conversations in your head just for your own amusement. Obviously, I amused myself thoroughly with all of this. Okay, next person. Мой самый любимый человек в русской истории это Петр Великий. Петр Великий, founder of St. Petersburg. He was founder of the Russian Navy. He was credited with kind of bringing Russia to the West, making it more of a European powerhouse. Up until then, Russia was kind of considered like in the Dark Ages and very Asian and mysterious, and Peter the Great made it more of a European powerhouse. So he loved the sea. He founded the Russian Navy, and he really was very big on access to the sea, whether it's the Black Sea or the Baltic Sea. He felt like Russia needed access to the sea, and that international policy is still in effect to this day. So, okay, so we come to Peter the Great, and we want to ask him about his city. What was the city he founded? He hated Moscow. He wanted a totally different, more European capital. So we would say to him, Ваш город, то есть Санкт-Петербург. And we're going to ask him a question, and he's, of course, going to get offended because he has no patience for fools. So we're going to say, Извините, Петр Великий, ваш город красивый? Какие интересные места у вас там есть? Да? So, ваш город красивый? Is your city beautiful? Какие интересные места у вас там есть? What interesting places do you have there? And then, of course, he's going to just be so annoyed with your ignorance, and he's going to say, какой глупый вопрос. У нас есть все. И море, и парки, и красивая архитектура, и каналы, и дворец, и так. Вот. Okay, so he starts listing off all the beautiful things that St. Petersburg has. Now, you want to keep the conversation going because you have this opportunity to have a conversation with like one of the most influential characters of Russian history. And so how would you ask him which place is your favorite? Which place is your favorite? Место is a word for place, and it's a neuter. Какое место ваше самое любимое? Какое место ваше самое любимое? And then again, in our imagination, we get to imagine, how would Peter answer? And how would I use my current Russian knowledge to try and answer it to the best of my abilities? He says, мой дворец Петергоф, он большой, и море рядом. Да? Я очень люблю море. Да, это точно. Петр Великий очень любил море. Да. Вот. Okay, another question you could ask him is, как вы думаете, какой город лучше? Петербург или Москва? Okay, so for those of you who know anything about Peter the Great, ему очень не нравилась Москва, очень не нравилась. Он думает, что это ужасный город, грязный, некрасивый, да, вот. So he's gonna answer, да что вы, again. All of these Russian imaginary friends are berating you in their head, which, by the way, is culturally authentic. So do be mentally prepared to be berated every once in a while. So Peter the Great says, да что вы, Москва ужасный город, ужасный, horrible. Moscow is a horrible city. Очень не люблю этот город. Какой фу, ужас, да? So he really hated Moscow. He had some serious PTSD associated with Moscow. You can read up on that. So I don't blame him for wanting a fresh start. Okay, next person. So I had super fun with my Lenin dialogues anytime we're talking with Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, the leader of the Communist Revolution in 1917. I had some fun with him. You'll see. I highly recommend getting the textbook so you can enjoy it. So we're just messing with Lenin just for our own amusement because we know how passionate he is about the communist revolution. So we're just messing with him, and we want to be like, oh, sorry, Lenin, I forgot which revolution was yours, the French Revolution or the October Revolution. So let's mess with him. Are you ready? We're gonna say, ой, извините, Владимир Ильич, я забыл, какая революция ваша? Октябрьская или французская? And again, maybe he berates you. Да что вы? Да какой вы дурак? Ну, что вы? And then he says, in all caps, Великая Октябрьская коммунистическая революция. Okay, so this is going to be an ongoing joke with Lenin in my textbook. And notice, this is great because this gave us practice to change our adjectives to be all feminine because revoluция is feminine, right? Okay, let's think of a follow-up question to keep this tree branching out. How could you ask him, why do you like this revolution or why do you like communism? Почему вам нравится коммунизм? Yeah? And then again, we try and anticipate, what do we think he would say based on what we know about Lenin and communism? So he says, капиталисты нечестные люди. Они не люди, они свиньи. So maybe you understand that. Капиталисты нечестные люди. They're dishonest people. In fact, они не люди. They're not people. Они свиньи. They're pigs, right? And that's a very common trope that you see in Soviet propaganda, is portraying the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, as pigs. Okay? Another question you could ask him is, maybe what did he think about the French Revolution? I mean, that was creating a certain degree of equality, right? How does he feel about it? So you say, а французская революция тоже хорошая? Французская революция тоже хорошая? And then he answers, да, ну слишком долгая была. Правда, слишком долгая. It went on for too long, whereas the communist revolution was done in about 6 months. It was over and done with. Whereas the French Revolution went on and on and on and on and then backtracked and then, so ain't nobody got time for that as far as Lenin's concerned. Anyway, so just a reminder, like I said, we're doing this because when we make these conversation trees, it really helps you figure out just how much Russian you know. What do you have in your toolbox? Can you create sentences? Can you go back and forth, even if it's just inside your mind with your imaginary Russian friends? Can you create the back and forth? The back and forth is what will make you fluent in the language. Can you go back and forth? Not can you answer a set of memorized questions, but can you go back and forth? Can you listen to what they say and elaborate on it? And then elaborate on the next thing. And then, so again, that's how you build fluency. Okay, last one. This one's controversial, but many people are interested in Russian and Soviet history because of this person. And if you don't know anything about him, again, the things I say in this textbook are in fact true. Of course, I have to talk about it in very simplified Russian, but yes. So here we go. Iosif Vissarionovich Djugashvili Stalin. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, he came into power after Lenin. Lenin did not want him to come into power. He did not trust him. He born in Georgia, was supposed to be a monk. His mom wanted him to become a monk, but he got involved in communist ideology, and obviously those two are mutually exclusive. Anyway, if you don't know much about Stalin, I highly recommend it because he's very important in understanding current day politics in Russia as well, and kind of, people's opinions on Putin. It's eerily similar to their opinions of Stalin as well. So again, Stalin is credited with eliminating all sorts of not only enemies, but entire, genocide and sorts of things. So here's a little bit of tidbit of information for you. But like I said, do your own research on Stalin. And then again, everything in the textbook is just more lighthearted and jovial. But all of these characters in Russian history are definitely worth researching. Okay, so imagine we get to have this conversation with Stalin, but it's at our very limited, primitive abilities that we currently have in Russian. So we say, Здравствуйте, товарищ Сталин. У вас есть друзья? This is a больной вопрос, if you know anything about Stalin. So больной вопрос means like a painful subject. Это больной вопрос to ask him if he has friends. У вас есть друзья? And he says, нет, Я их убил. Теперь я очень одинокий. So sick. I have a sick and twisted sense of humor, just by the way. So he says, no, I killed them, and now I'm lonely, right? So again, this is just the concept of what can you do with your Russian currently? Because you don't know how to talk about betrayal and paranoia and blah, blah, blah. And right. So instead, we just have to keep our Russian very primitive. Anyway, so you're like, oh, okay, well, that's really sad. And then we might say, why did you kill them? Почему их убил? And then he says, они не хорошие коммунисты, они плохие друзья. So hopefully you can understand that by this point in your Russian studies. So he says, они не хорошие коммунисты. They're not good communists. Они плохие друзья. They're bad friends. And then we want to suggest to him the thing that nobody dared to suggest to him in his lifetime. Может быть, у вас паранойя? Может быть, у вас паранойя? Maybe you have some paranoia issues? And then he says, нет, я самый лучший и умный человек на свете. Which again is how he responded to people who ever tried to call him out. So what is he saying here? Нет, я самый лучший и умный человек на свете. No, I am the best and smartest person on earth. Which, again, is kind of how he treated people. Okay, then here's another direction, another branch we could take this conversation. Жаль, right? So, oh, that's a pity that you're lonely. А дети у вас есть? Дети у вас есть? What are we asking there? А дети у вас есть? Right? So we ask him, do you have children? А дети у вас есть? And he says, у меня дочь и сыновья. Дети мне нравятся. Right? So he had a daughter and sons as well. И сыновья. Remember, сыновья is our irregular plural. And then we say, они любят вас. Они любят вас. Do they love you? And then it gets больная тема again. This gets awkward and painful again. And he says, не очень, which is not entirely true. They loved him very much when they were little. Stalin was actually famous for being really great with kids. Kids adored him. Interestingly, again, I highly recommend reading the biography on him, the Stephen Kotkin, I believe it is, a biography of him. Super interesting person. So, and by the way, it will just give you more to work with when you have conversations with your imaginary Russian friends in your head. So I highly recommend learning about these different, just pull up a quick 15-minute video about all these different people in Russian history. And I would love to hear what your conversation trees would entail. What kinds of questions would you ask for these people? But again, this conversation tree introduces the idea of creating the back and forth. You can't life is not just a series of answer a bunch of questions. You're not going to get interrogated when you start a conversation with a Russian. You're going to be expected to go back and forth with them and to play off of however they answer the questions. So, хорошо. Это все на сегодня. Увидимся на следующем уроке. Пока-пока.